let me give you a brief update of our journey. We're on the 13th day of this Marco Polo Drive of peace, culture, and sustainable development. It's been a wonderful drive, and our group, led by myself and a leading Chinese investor named Patrick Zhang, who uh, founded and leads M31 Capital in Shanghai. The two of us and a large group together with us, my wife and Patrick's son, and many people from BYD whose vehicles we're riding in, and many people joining along the way for 1 or 2 days has made this first 13 days absolutely wonderful. We started, as you know, in Rome, and we started in Rome for many reasons. Rome is, in many ways, for the Western world, the eternal city. It's the city that has been at the center of Western history for more than 2,000 years. And it is the city of the papacy. And the Pope plays a major role in the Marco Polo journey and in our journey. In the times of Marco Polo, it was precisely because the Mongol Emperor Kublai Khan asked Niccolo and Maffeo Polo, the father and the uncle of Marco Polo, to journey back from Kublai Khan's capital, which is present-day Beijing, to meet the Pope in Rome and to convey Kublai Khan's request that the Pope send 100 wise men to the court of the Mongols to help the Mongol leadership understand the wider world. And so the two brothers, Niccolo and Maffeo, journeyed back from Hanbalik, which is today's Beijing and was the uh, winter capital of the Mongol Empire, back to see the Pope. By the time they returned in 1269 AD, so about 750 years ago, there was no Pope. Clement IV had died, and uh, no Pope had been elected yet. They returned to Venice, uh, and for the first time, Niccolo met his son, Marco, who was then 15 years old, because when Niccolo had left for the East back in 1255, Marco had not yet been born. So I guess in 1254, maybe he left. Marco had not yet been born. So the father and the son meet each other. They want to carry a message from the Pope to Kublai Khan, but there is no Pope yet. So they wait a couple of years, and then they meet an ambassador of the Pope or a legate of the papacy, a man named Teobaldo Visconti, in the city of Acre, which is in present-day Israel. And this papal legate sends his blessings, and because there is no pope, he gives the blessings to these two to go back east. After they embark from Acre, going east back to Kublai Khan's capital, suddenly messengers arrive to tell them a pope has been elected. And lo and behold, the pope that was elected was none other than Teobaldo Visconti, the one that they had met. He went from being a papal ambassador or papal legate to being the pope himself. He became Pope Gregory the 10th in the year 1271. And he sent his blessings. He sent two wise men to the court of Kublai Khan. But frankly, those two wise men chickened out. They didn't want to make the arduous journey, so they fled. So it was Marco Polo and his father and his uncle that continued on eastward. When they made their journey, they took a route a little bit south of the route that we're taking. They went from Venice to Acre by sea, and then across what is present day Israel into what is present day Syria and Iraq, and down to a place that we all know from the news today, Hormuz. Uh, the Strait of Hormuz was very important then as it is today because it was a major port. And the intention of the Polos was to travel by sea to China. But when they looked at their ships, they weren't convinced that they wanted to travel that way. So they decided to go over land. And they continued through today's Iran, Afghanistan, into Pakistan, uh, today's India, across the Himalayas or the Pamir Mountains into China, and then from China to Kublai Khan's port. Now, interestingly, on the way back, they went by sea. So when 20 years later, in 1295, the Polos returned to Venice. They went by Chinese vessel, a Chinese junk, it's called, a large sailing vessel and a very capable one. And where did they sail to? Interestingly, to the Strait of Hormuz. And they disembarked in Hormuz. And very important for us, they went from Hormuz to eastern Anatolia. And if you look at the map, Anatolia, of course, is that big landmass that is at the heart of modern Turkey. And eastern Anatolia has the city of Trabzon, which you can find on the map. We were there about an hour ago in Trabzon. And Trabzon was the place where the Polos went from the online transit from Hormuz to Trabzon. They got back on a ship and they sailed to Constantinople, or today's Istanbul. And then from there, they went on to Venice. So we intersected with the Polo journey. When we were in Trabzon just now, we were greeted by a new BYD uh, showroom. And I remarked as I thanked them for the warm welcome that we were in Trabzon on the 730th anniversary of Marco Polo's journey. So we started in Rome. I am carrying a message from Pope Leo the 14th. He's a wonderful pope. He's the first North American pope. And he issued a very important encyclical last month called Magnifica Humanitas. And I recommend everybody to read it. It's a beautiful message to the whole world, to Catholics and non-Catholics alike, about the need for peace, about the ways to peace, and about governing artificial intelligence in the 21st century. Because the Pope's very much involved in our very practical current issues, and that's a tradition of the papacy. So I am carrying copies of this encyclical. I can show you, Magnifica Humanitas, and I'm delivering them to all of the leaders that we're meeting along the way as a message of peace from Pope Leo the 14th, in the same tradition as the Polos carrying the message from Pope Gregory to Kublai Khan. And I feel very, very thrilled and humbled about that. Well, our journey started in Rome. We drove north to Bologna, where we charged our cars in a flash charging station because one of the hallmarks of the new BYDs is that if you have the right charging station, you could charge your vehicle in 9 minutes, which we did in this supercharger, flash charge. Then we went to see the home of Ferrari because cars are a theme of this trip. And we went to one of the most famed and exalted car companies of the racing world and of luxury vehicles, combining art and motoring. So that was a lot of fun. And we went from Ferrari headquarters to Venice, which is of course, the birthplace and the death place of Marco Polo. It's the hometown. And we saw in the archives many remarkable documents, including Marco Polo's own last will and testament, which was amazing to see. And from Venice, we continued eastward, still in Europe, across the Balkan Peninsula. So if you look at Europe on the map, there are three peninsulas that jut into the Mediterranean: the Iberian Peninsula, Spain and Portugal, the Italian Peninsula, and the Balkans Peninsula. And we crossed into the Balkans Peninsula from Italy to Slovenia and had a wonderful meeting with the president of Slovenia, President Musar. And then we crossed from Slovenia to Croatia and had a wonderful meeting with the president of Croatia, President Milanovic. And then from Croatia, we went to Serbia. And in Serbia, we had a wonderful meeting with the President Vucic and a wonderful conference organized by Vuk Jeremic, who's a former president of the General Assembly and a former foreign minister of Serbia. And he put on a large conference, which we attended, on connectivity and sustainability, exactly the themes of our drive. From Serbia, we continued eastward and went to an ancient city called Plovdiv, which is Bulgaria's second largest city. It's also a historic gem because it's a place that's been settled for thousands of years. And we know of many civilizations in Plovdiv over the many millennia, including the Hittites and the Phrygians and the Malaysian, not Malaysians, but from Miletus, Greece, uh, colonists, and then the Achaemenid Empire, the Persian Empire, then Alexander the Great's Hellenistic empires. Then Plovdiv became part of the Roman Empire, and there's a wonderful Roman theater from around 2,000 years ago, and a Roman stadium because this was a major outpost for Rome in the province of Thrace in the Roman Empire. Well, Plovdiv was very exciting, but we continued the journey eastward and we came to the famed, fabled, remarkable, in many ways unique city of Constantinople, or today's Istanbul. And Istanbul, of course, is the Turkish name and the capital, not the capital, the historic capital of Turkey. The capital, of course, is Ankara in the middle of Anatolia. But uh, Istanbul or Constantinople is uh, a city again with thousands of years of settlement, but it became an imperial capital under the Roman Empire when in 325 AD, the Roman Emperor Constantine declared it to be his capital in the East, so that Rome and Constantinople would be the two capitals of the Roman Empire. And Constantine uh, created the greatness of the city. There was a small city there called Byzantium, an important trading center, But now, under the Roman emperor's authority, it became the city of Constantine, Constantinopolis, or Constantinople, opal being from polis or city. So it's the city of Constantine. And it is filled with profound history. It became, after the fall of the Western Roman Empire, the capital of the Eastern Roman Empire, which continued onward even after Rome was conquered by the Goths and the Visigoths. And the Eastern Roman Empire thrived. Constantinople was the capital. And it lived on for another 1,000 years as the Byzantine Empire, or the Eastern Roman Empire, until Constantinople was captured by the Ottoman Turks. And the leader was Mehmet II, Mehmet the Conqueror. And he was just 21 years old when he conquered Constantinople and established the Ottoman Empire as the ruling empire over all of today's Turkey, plus expanding that empire into the Balkans region. And of course, the Ottoman Empire had 500 years of very historic rule. And in many ways, it was a very successful empire, but it eventually declined and fell in World War I when it was on the losing side of World War I. Out of the Ottoman Empire emerged the modern Republic of Turkey, and now by its official name, Turkey. So Constantinople was Istanbul was thrilling to visit, to see the Blue Mosque, to see Hagia Sophia, the great church that was established by Constantine and then later became a mosque after the Ottoman conquests, and to see many of the other wondrous sights. From there, we continued eastward across northern Anatolia. In other words, hugging the southern coast of the Black Sea. And we have been to many wonderful sites in the Black Sea region. We were in the city of Samsun, which is a major port, again, a settlement of thousands of years and considerable history. It's also the place where modern Turkey was born because Ataturk, who was a general who fought for the independence of Turkey after World War I, launched his war for Turkey's independence from Samsun. From there, we continued our drive east, and we reached Trabzon, which I described to you, the port city that was the western end of the Silk Route, because by the time you got to Trabzon, then you transferred from on land to uh, a vessel to carry you to Constantinople. So Trabzon was the place where we first intersected with the real Silk Road, not just the end of the Silk Road in Europe or in Constantinople, but the real Silk Road passageway. We also visited what's called a caravanserai, which is a place where the caravan would stop like a hotel of the 15th century or 13th century. And we had a dinner in a caravanserai, which has been made into a major tourist site, historic site in Samsun. So right now I'm in Rize. Rize is a city you'll find on the map in the eastern end of northern Anatolia on the Black Sea. I can see the Black Sea over my shoulder through the window of the hotel where we're staying. And we will continue eastward to uh, Georgia and to Azerbaijan in the next few days. We'll be traveling to a city called Batumi in Georgia, and then from there to Tbilisi, and then from Tbilisi to Baku. So these are all now famed historic sites along the Silk Road. They're all places where civilization has been uh, thousands of years in operation. These are cities of continuous settlement for thousands of years. Many empires, Persian, Macedonian, from Alexander, Hellenistic, Roman sometimes, later Persian empires, uh, and it's very thrilling to see all these layers of history. But one thing has been constant. These have all been places of east-west interconnection for at least 2,000 years. So being on that route and knowing that it's a place of strong interconnection today is quite thrilling. Well, that's a summary quickly of where we've been, and I would be delighted to uh, discuss with you any issues, talk about any current events or any aspects of our trip or Marco Polo or of the history of the places that we're visiting.
Thank you so much, Jeff. We do have a number of questions coming in on all sorts of topics. I will try to get
Great.
through as many of them as we can. One kind of repeated question here. If you could briefly explain the relationship between the course and what you're doing here and the drive overall. So
Yeah,
I'm trying to say they are two
great.
distinct but related projects.
Of course. So the drive is a 43-day drive uh, going from June 12 in Rome to July 26th in Hong Kong. And the purpose of the drive precisely is to champion the three causes of the whole concept: peace, culture, and sustainable development. And the drive is both to meet people, uh, leaders from each of the countries along the way, as well as to celebrate culture and cuisine, to see the UNESCO heritage sites and the historic sites, and to also demonstrate the ease and comfort of riding in electric vehicles with the reliable charging stations all along a 15,000 mile pathway, because this, I believe, is our future, sustainable mobility. So this is the purpose of the trip. The course is a partnership with the trip. I want you to know the history of the Silk routes, the story of Marco Polo himself, and the importance of this East-West network of connectivity today. And I am also an advocate of this East-West connectivity. I believe in a world that is interconnected, trading, peaceful, exchanging goods and services, and benefiting from our cultural diversity and our international trade. Since I'm an economist, uh, I can say something about the uh, material dimensions of trade and emphasize that trade is a win-win activity, both for sellers and for buyers. The process of exchange helps both sides. And the idea of globally open trade is an idea that is beneficial for all of the world. It makes technologies and specific goods and services produced in different places in the world available for everybody. It lowers the costs of meeting our needs in a variety of ways. It spreads ideas. It creates a larger incentive for innovation because if you are innovating for a worldwide market, you get a higher return to your breakthroughs than if you're innovating for a local or a national market. So the idea of an interconnected world is not only our reality, but it should be our goal. And we're living at a time where, because of great geopolitical tensions, and frankly, the fact that China has risen in its capacity and its technology so much in the last 30 years that it's scaring the United States and Europe and leading them to believe that they can't compete with China and therefore aiming for protectionism and breaking the international linkages. We're saying don't do that. Trade is good for everybody. China's rise is good for everybody. And we want to understand that in more detail. So the course is the uh, window for you to delve deeply into the same issues that motivated the Marco Polo Drive in the first place. And for me, the conceptual issues about peace, culture, and sustainable development are in complete conjunction or harmony with the practical issues of making a drive across 12 countries and 15,000 kilometers in these 43 days.
Thanks for that clarification. And so, yes, we put some links in the chat so you can follow along on the Marco Polo Drive. It has its own social media, webpage, YouTube, and then the course is where Prof. Sachs is really going to dive deep into these themes and the history. So they complement each other. I'm really happy to see so many questions. I'm a little afraid we won't get to all of them, so I'll do my best. One question that I found very interesting that we'd love to hear your thoughts on is there are so many wonderful stories about travel in our in the fictional canon, and I'm wondering what do you and obviously you mentioned Marco Polo's memoirs of his own travels. What do you think captures the imagination about these types of journeys
Yeah,
in fiction, in history, that kind of question?
great. Yes, this is a wonderful question. First of all, I'm biased. I love travel, and I've been traveling all my life, even from a young age, because my parents were so kind as to take my sister and me on trips from an early age, first inside the United States and then visiting other countries. And so I got hooked on travel from a very early age as a wonderful, wonderful activity. I learned early on that to truly understand another society as best one can, of course, you have to be there. You have to make friends in those places. You have to have local guides who can help you to understand what is really the nature of politics or the nature of economic life in these other places that you and I won't know from our own uh, experience in our own home country. So I believe that travel is essential for understanding an interconnected world. I've also learned something very basic from travel, which sounds maybe rosy-eyed, but it's actually true. Uh, I've had nothing but positive experiences in travel of warm hospitality all over the world from every culture, every uh, civilization, every religion and race and so forth. And that's a real lesson of life, which is that there are no enemies. There's no intrinsic enemies in this world. I just refuse to classify the world as us and them. This is a big mistake. It's us and us. And sometimes we're smart about it, and sometimes we're stupid about it, but it's us and us. There's no them out there, and there is no world of any permanent enemy. Unfortunately, that's not the prevailing view in a lot of places where the world's map is drawn. These are on our side and these are on the other side. My own country, the United States, in its government, tends to draw such sharp lines, which I really reject, which is why I don't much care for American foreign policy. Russia's not an enemy. China's not an enemy, certainly. And I don't know of any natural enemies. I do believe that if you can meet other people, sit down with them, discuss, reason, not only will you make friends, but you'll also resolve even long-standing conflicts. So this is a first point about travel, which is, uh, or a second point. First point is it's fun. The world's diverse cultures are wonderfully varied. Cuisines are wonderfully varied. Architecture is wonderfully varied. And so you see a lot that is just joyful. But second, you also learn of the essential unity of humanity, not its differences. And uh, this, for me, it makes it absolutely thrilling and a high priority to take the kinds of trips that I'm lucky to take with my wife and our friends uh, in these 43 days because it's fascinating and you learn a lot every single day. Now, throughout history, there have been great travelers who preceded the rest. They were kind of explorers and narrators as well as travelers, so they helped us to understand the world. And Marco Polo's travels, which he dictated after returning from the journey that was 24 years long, from 1271 to 1295, that he dictated upon his return, changed history because not only is it a fascinating tale, which any of you can read, and I recommend reading, but also because it opened the eyes of Europe to Asia. And it inspired many thoughts and it inspired the dream of trade and connection with Asia. And it is not a coincidence that Christopher Columbus, who sailed, of course, from Spain to the New World for the Europeans, the discovery of the Americas, was sailing to reach Asia, and he was carrying with him a heavily annotated copy of Marco Polo's book, because Marco Polo's book was going to be for Christopher Columbus the description of the places that he was going to encounter on his voyage. So Marco Polo's uh, book played a huge role in Western thought of inspiration to know Asia, to find routes to Asia, to trade with Asia, and alas, ultimately in the 19th century to conquer part of Asia, a process that mercifully was reversed in the second half of the 20th century. There have been other great travelers like Marco Polo that played something like a similar role in opening the eyes of their compatriots. Ibn Battuta is another very famous traveler. He actually traveled probably larger distances. He traveled all over Asia as an Arab traveler, and his reports were profound as well in opening the eyes of his contemporaries to the Eastern world. There are many other travelers who also I'm coming to learn about as I understand more about Marco Polo's trip. that played the role of great pioneers. You know, when we drive long distances these days, and I try somehow to think about the fact of covering those distances, not on a highway, but on a horse or on a camel as we get to Central Asia over a number of years rather than a number of days. The bravery and the fortitude and the determination of these earlier travelers is absolutely astounding. I mean, today, frankly speaking, you ride in an electric vehicle, you have your network charged, you can reach anyone, call anyone, Zoom with anyone from anywhere. It's a different kind of reality from the reality of the Polos or of Ibn Battuta or of Benjamin of Tudela or of other great travelers in the medieval world. So we really have to admire them profoundly for what they did to help us understand our world.
And I think also those um, chronicles, both real and also captured through fiction, as the question said, travel can be a bit of a privilege for some people. So if you're not able to physically go somewhere, all of that wonderful insight can be captured and shared, and probably now more than any other time in history. So that as you're doing by bringing us along on your journey. Um, Shifting gears a little bit, we've had a couple questions both about understanding the economic diversity and the different types of economies that Marco Polo would have encountered across his journey. Obviously, we know the Silk Road brought a lot of prosperity, but were there different spots of prosperity and less prosperity across the Silk Road? And also, what can we learn about development in today's developing economies from that experience?
Yeah, wonderful. Um, the Silk Road was a network of interconnections, a kind of you would call it a graph because it has vertices and edges. A vertex is a major city, and an edge in graph theory means it's a route that connects two cities, two vertexes. So there wasn't one Silk Road, there was a Silk network. And it meant that there were many cities on the east-west corridor, and they were interconnected in transit, and the main such centers became very cosmopolitan. This is important. Cosmopolitan means a city of the world, a city of the cosmos, a city that interconnects many different cultures. Istanbul, when it was, especially during its age as Constantinople in the medieval world, was such a cosmopolitan city because there would have been Greeks, Armenians, Jews, Christians, uh, of course, with the Ottoman rule, Muslims, Islamic scholars, artisans, uh, merchants, financiers, a very remarkably mixed culture. And generally, where you had cosmopolitan cities, you had great exchange of knowledge. Uh, and when there was enlightened leadership, you would also have centers of learning, universities, or in the Islamic world, madrasas, established astronomical observatories, patronage for the arts and for science. And many of the places that we will be visiting along the route are such places of high culture and high science in the medieval world. Constantinople, Trabzon, where we just were an hour ago, Tbilisi and Baku, uh, Bukhara and Samarkand, and other places that we'll be visiting were like that. So the reason why we see such splendid architecture as we'll see in these cities is that they were great cities, rich from trade, often from local artisanship or from silk weaving or from other industrial activities or from mining sites nearby. But these were places that were uh, very prosperous and with reasonably large populations already 1,000 years ago, sometimes several 100,000 people in some of the biggest cities along the Silk Route. There wasn't the kind of difference between rich and poor in today's world because no place was rich in terms that you would find familiar in today's world. The technologies of the time just didn't allow for the kind of income per person remotely close to what we enjoy today in the more prosperous places. But in relative terms, these places were very prosperous, though the gap between the rich and the poor maybe was 3 to 1, whereas now it can be 10 to 1 or 20 to 1. So we can say that there were places of prosperity, especially these major cosmopolitan centers uh, that benefited from this East-West trade and all the knowledge that it brought from both East and West. But the gap between the rich of the day and the poor of the day was a smaller gap than the gap that we have today between the rich and the poor in the world. Things began to change somewhat gradually after 1492 and 1498. 1492, of course, is the date of Christopher Columbus's voyage by which the Europeans discovered the existence of a new hemisphere, uh, which was basically unknown until then. And then 1498 is the date of Vasco da Gama's voyage from Portugal down the west coast of Africa, around the Cape of Good Hope, and then to the coast, the western coast of India. And by making that sea voyage and proving that you could sail east to west, west to east, using the monsoon winds in the appropriate seasons for the east-west voyage, and then for the west to, or from the west to the east voyage, and then the reverse of the wind directions for the east to the west voyage. Suddenly trade could be carried on by sea rather than by land on a large scale. And sea-based transport of commodities is much cheaper than land-based transport. So the advent of the sea routes connecting Europe and Asia really changed the prospects of the Silk Road cities because trade began to diminish with the Silk routes over land as more and more trade went by ocean-based trade. It didn't happen at once. It was a long, gradual process. But by the 19th century, it was pretty much a definitive process. Central Asia and the old Silk routes were in real decline, and the gain of power was with the ocean-based transoceanic empires of Europe. The European powers achieved early industrialization using the new mechanization of textiles and of metallurgy and of other large other industrial processes, and deploying the steam engine for a massive increase of power for industry. And that, of course, also gave a huge military advantage to the early industrializing nations. So the places along the Silk Route went into decline in the 19th century, and the places with the ocean empires, and especially Britain, went into the ascendancy in the 19th century, and the United States in the ascendancy in much of the 20th century. So the relative power and relative prosperity shifted. And this is why the Silk Route became almost a historical relic, because cities like Samarkand, which were the great centers of learning and prosperity and architecture a few hundred years ago, became relics of the past for centuries. But now things are changing again with the rise of China. Now we have a large part of the world economy centered in East Asia. And so the scale of trade between East and West and the balance of technology between East and West has changed dramatically in the last 40 years. And this is leading to a new emphasis on overland connectivity between Europe and China, and between China and its neighbors in Central Asia and Western Asia and Southern Asia. China launched its Belt and Road Initiative as an initiative essentially to create a 21st century Silk Route, both over land and by sea. And because of the translation issues, it's a little bit ironic, but the Belt and Road expression means the belt is the land and the road in the Chinese is the sea route. So the Belt and Road Initiative is an east-west connectivity, both by land, the belt, and the sea, the road. And I give China great credit for launching this initiative because it is reestablishing the infrastructure for east-west trade in a modern and sustainable way. And now overland trade is benefited by fast rail, for example. This is a new development. Of course, it's benefited by digital connectivity. It's benefited by green power interconnecting the cities of East Asia, Central Asia, and Western Asia. So we're in a new technology, but the old east-west corridors are coming back to dynamism.
Sorry. Um, so I think we've got a lot of people planning their own road trips now in the chat.
Good.
A lot of you've inspired a lot of people. A lot of questions about logistics and how why you chose the route that you did, why you're going through some countries, not others. Obviously, I think there's some geopolitics
Yeah.
there. Um, about what it's like to be with an electric vehicle. Is it comfortable? Are there enough charging stations? Do you need visas to go through all of these places? How does that work on a practical level?
Yeah, so of course, on a practical level, everybody has to check their own visa situations because depending on your passport, you'll face either open borders or very tough visa issues. So everybody has their own visa challenges. Our trip was strongly planned by BYD. There are several vehicles in our caravan. This is really a caravan. And they have meticulously uh, modeled where the charging stations are, where we should stop, the travel each day. So it's a well-planned trip. And BYD and the team of my colleague Patrick Zhang have done a wonderful job of planning. But it's an absolutely feasible trip. There are charging stations all along the way. When we reached Anatolia and we're crossing the southern coast of the Black Sea, I would not have known whether there our charging stations that would be reliable. Of course, BYD checked on this, but I'll tell you, the first charging station we pulled into was a very large mall uh, on the highway in this northern east-west road of Anatolia along the coast of the Black Sea. And there were 81 charging stations there, 81 individual charging points. So it wasn't a long line to wait for one or two chargers. There were chargers stretched all across this very, very large shopping mall. And of course, we charged up. And I was impressed that the charging stations themselves all had solar panels across the roofs. So these are charging stations that are themselves being powered by renewable energy. It was wonderful to see. I can tell you the cars are doing beautifully and the charging is doing beautifully. And we've had no issues about charging except that it needs to be planned because our driver, who is absolutely wonderful and part of the BYD team, knows every time we charge where the next charge will be and can calculate, of course, quite predictably uh, how to how to budget the battery time and so forth safely. Um, this is really no different from making sure that if you're on long stretches of highway, that there are highway stops along the way in a traditional internal combustion engine. But because charging stations are relatively new, you do have to check, but they're being rolled out very, very quickly. We just learned in Turkey, my wife asked one of the BYD officials, why were there so many charging stations? And uh, the answer was that these are private companies, actually. Of course, they charge for charging, but they're setting up charging stations on a commercial basis. And this is, of course, happening in many, many places. The shift from internal combustion engine to electric vehicles is happening very fast. And I say hooray for that. This is very much what is needed for the decarbonization transformation.
I think you're going to have a side gig as a travel agent. Lots of people
Absolutely
want your.
great.
You're gonna have to write a Michelin guide. All right, as we come to the end of the hour, and I'm so sorry we didn't get to everyone, but we will have two more Q&A sessions with Professor Sachs in the next couple of weeks. I think the next one's going to be July 10th. We'll send out some information when that's confirmed. Um, Last question: is there anything in particular that you're looking forward to in the rest of your trip, or yeah, what do you hope to get out of the rest of the trip? Anything specific?
Yeah, just to tell you, we're visiting. I've traveled a lot, and my wife and I have been to almost all of the, I think, if I'm not mistaken, yes, all of the countries on our route before, but not all of these places. And when we come to each of these cities, wow, the places we've not been before, it's just fascinating and really exciting. So I'm excited about what we're going to see for the first time in each of these places. I'm excited for who we're going to meet in each of these places. And in several of the places, there are exciting initiatives that we'll be launching uh, with the government of that country, typically around challenges of sustainable development. So stay tuned. There's going to be lots of fun, interesting developments for all of us along the way.
Thank you very much, Professor Sachs. Yeah, everyone keep up with the course so we can learn about the history and the journey. Follow the Marco Polo Drive, check out the website. Professor Sachs, thank you and safe travels, and we'll see you in a couple of
Thanks a
weeks.
lot.
Thank
Bravo
you.
to
Have a safe
everybody.
trip.
Thank you. See you soon. Bye bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye bye, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks
Thank you,
for joining.
Professor Sachs. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.